Welcome back to Palestine Bookshelf. I'm Stephen Heiner, and today we're going to be discussing Footnotes in Gaza by Joe Sacco. I've actually done a review of this before on my main Stephen Heiner channel. I'm quite happy with the review. It's an excellent work. Joe has, in a sense, invented non-fiction cartoons in service of a cause as important as that of Palestine. So rather than redo that review, I'll put a link in the description as well as a card so you can go watch it yourself. I'm simply going to read a little bit from Joe's preface to the book. I'll show you a couple of pictures and then I will read from the appendix. The genesis for this book dates to the spring of 2001 when the journalist Chris Hedges and I prepared to go on assignment to the Gaza Strip for Harper's Magazine. He as a writer with me as illustrator. We had decided to focus on how Palestinians in one town, Hind Rajab, were coping during the early months of the Second Intifada against the Israeli occupation. I recalled a reference I'd read many years before in Noam Chomsky's book The Fateful Triangle, basically a short quote from a United Nations document about a large-scale killing of civilians in Khan Yunis in 1956, and Chris agreed that we should add this barely noted historical episode to our story if it turned out to have some validity and current resonance. If you'd like to know more about Chris Hedges, I'll put a link for a book I did of his called A Genocide Foretold. I'll put a link in the description as well as a card. Once in Khan Yunis, we devoted about a day to gathering eyewitness testimony to what had happened in the town in November 1956 during the Suez Canal crisis, when Israeli forces briefly occupied the Egyptian-ruled Gaza Strip. Old men and women had stark stories to tell about their fathers and husbands being shot in their houses or being lined up in the streets and killed by Israeli soldiers. One of those we interviewed was Abed El-Aziz El-Rantisi, a senior official of Hamas, the Islamic Resistance Party, who was later assassinated by an Israeli missile. El-Rantisi, who in 1956 was 9 years old, told us his uncle had been killed that day. "I still remember the wailing and tears of my father over his brother," he said. "I couldn't sleep for many months after that. It left a wound in my heart that can never heal. I'm telling you a story and I'm almost crying. That sort of action can never be forgotten. They planted hatred in our hearts." Chris deemed what had happened in Khan Yunis in 1956 a significant part of the town's history, and he included several paragraphs about it in the Harper's article. For whatever reason, that section was cut by the magazine's editors. I found that galling. This episode, seemingly the greatest massacre of Palestinians on Palestinian soil, if the UN refugees of 275 dead are to be believed, hardly deserved to be thrown back on the pile of obscurity. But there it lay, like innumerable historical tragedies over the ages that barely rate footnote status in the broad sweep of history, even though, as Al-Rantisi alluded, they often contained the seeds of the grief and anger that shape present-day events. To me, the story of the Khan Yunis killings was not so easily dispensable. I had done some digging, and almost nothing had been written in English about the episode. I determined to go back to Gaza to research what had taken place in 1956. As I prepared, I began to learn more about another incident that had occurred around the same time, on November the 12th, in the neighboring town of Rafah, in which scores of Palestinian men were killed. What had happened there? Again, a couple of sentences and a UN report were all that saved the incident from outright oblivion. In some ways, the Rafah story began to interest me more. The violence done in Khan Yunis was shocking and brutal, but as I ascertained on my initial trip to Gaza with Chris, very straightforward. The killings in Rafah took place over a day-long screening operation for Palestinian guerrillas and soldiers. How had more than 100 people died in what should have been a standard, if complicated, military procedure? Had Israeli soldiers simply panicked and opened fire on the running crowd, as the UN report surmised? Creatively speaking, there were more layers to investigate with the Rafah story, more pieces of a puzzle to put together. In addition, almost all the men of military age were caught up in the sprawling Rafah incident, and many survivors would still be alive. At Khan Yunis, only a handful of those involved survived being lined up and shot, so this book is broken up into two major though uneven sections, one about Khan Yunis and the other, considerably longer, about Rafah. Most of the on-the-ground field research for this book took place during 2 trips to the Gaza Strip between November 2002 and March 2003. My main priority was to record the stories of Palestinian eyewitnesses to the events in Khan Yunis and Rafah. But 50 years is a long time to wait before asking people what they remember about a particular day. Thus, the recollections reproduced here have been scrutinized in light of an inevitable blurring of memory and are compared in their details. Did the survivors recall essentially the same thing? Documentary evidence is usually considered more reliable than oral testimony by historians, but the record is scant, and certain unsavory orders and reports are often kept off the books or are stored out of reach of even the most diligent researcher. Egyptian military records are closed to most inquiries. Certain UN records in Jordan and elsewhere that might shed some light are near unreachable. Still, it was important that available avenues be explored, and to this end I employed 2 Israeli researchers to go through the Israel Defense Forces archives. One of them also examined the Israel State Archives, the Knesset Archives, a press archive, and the Kol Ham, Communist Party, newspaper archive for any mention of the 2 incidents. Translations of key records and a list of Israeli historians and significant personnel consulted are included in the appendices at the end of the book. My hope is that this account will prompt former Israeli soldiers who might have witnessed the events of 1956 to offer their own recollections and points of view. Perhaps an Israeli historian needs to step into the breach. That's very optimistic of Joe. Besides the problems inherent in relying on memories, addressed more fully in the book, the reader should be aware that there is another filter through which these stories pass before reaching the page, namely my own visual interpretation. In essence, I am the set designer and the director of every scene that takes place in the 1940s and 1950s. In reconstructing what the towns and refugee camps of Gaza looked like, I relied heavily on photographs available at the United Nations Relief and Works Agency, UNRWA, archives in Gaza City. I also drew on physical descriptions related to me by Palestinians. Still, my active visualization, drawing in this case, comes with an unavoidable measure of refraction. My research did not take place in a vacuum. While I was investigating what happened in 1956, Israeli attacks were killing Palestinians, suicide bombers were killing Israelis, and elsewhere in the Middle East, the United States was gearing up for war in Iraq. Among the most critical developments in the daily lives of Gazans at the time was the wide-scale demolition of Palestinian homes in Rafah and Khan Yunis, which made its way into the fabric of this book. Interviews with Israeli military personnel for their take on the matter can be found in Appendix 2. However, even the present-day stories I tell here quickly fell under the category of history because the situation in Gaza has undergone 2 major changes since I started this project almost 7 years ago. If you're enjoying this content, please consider hitting like and subscribe. It's an easy way for you to help get this word out to other people who might be interested. First, in 2005, Israel unilaterally dismantled all the Jewish settlements in Gaza and left the small sliver of land entirely to its Palestinian inhabitants. However, Israel still tightly controlled Gaza's airspace, coastline, and its entry and exit points, save one. That was the Rafah terminal with access to Egypt, which severely limited movement to and from Gaza. In effect, the Gaza Strip, overcrowded and destitute, had not been freed from the Israel clamp, or the threat of withering attack or retaliation by Israeli forces, as witnessed in the winter of 2008-2009. Second, in 2007, the Islamic group Hamas seized control and has been in charge of Gaza ever since. Hamas, branded a terrorist organization by Israel in the United States, had won the majority of legislative seats in a 2006 election. A national unity government with its rival Fatah was unacceptable to the Israelis, who further tightened the screws on Gaza. When tensions between Fatah and Hamas boiled over, Hamas preemptively seized Gaza ahead of a U.S.-engineered coup by Fatah. What shocked Palestinians, even those disgusted with years of corruption under Fatah rule, was the ruthlessness with which Hamas crushed its Fatah opponents. The tradition of Palestinian militants, regardless of faction, standing shoulder to shoulder against Israel and not against each other was at an end. With the Hamas takeover, Israel declared the Gaza Strip an enemy entity. The blockade of Gaza, which was joined by the United States and the European Union, is, at this writing, almost complete. As someone in Gaza told me, events are continuous. Palestinians never seem to have the luxury of digesting one tragedy before the next one is upon them. When I was in Gaza, younger people often viewed my research into the events of 1956 with bemusement. What good would tending to history do them when they were under attack and their homes were being demolished now? But the past and present cannot be so easily disentangled. They are part of a remorseless continuum, a historical blur. Perhaps it is worth our while to freeze that churning forward movement and examine 1 or 2 events that were not only a disaster for the people who lived them, but might also be instructive for those who want to understand why and how, as El Rantisi said, hatred was planted in hearts. Joe Sacco, July 2009. And as I said, I'm only going to show you a couple of these, but I think they're evocative, particularly for our present situation. So this is of the scene in Rafah where the men were lined up. Not lined up. They were put into a schoolyard and had to sit with their heads down for most of the day, had to urinate on themselves. And at some point, they make an announcement. You will now go to your houses. Within 3 or 5 minutes, we want no one in the school. Anyone we find, we'll shoot. So basically, get out of here, scram. And when they had come in through the gate, they had been beaten. And most people didn't want to go back out through the gate, so they start climbing over the wall. And you can see here, this particular illustration, that as people started to climb over the wall collapsed. And you can see the women and children waiting there for their men. And I'm thinking of the scenes for the so-called Gaza Aid Initiative, which is, U.S. military contractors working for Israel to dispense aid. And the scenes that we've seen there are absolutely horrific. But they look like this, where people are being crowded in and forced into situations where they are injured or hurt. Another is families coming to pick up their murdered people. I think this is in Khan Yunis at night, and they don't want to make any noise lest they get shot by the Israelis. But these are the scenes that Palestinians have had to endure since 1948, going to try to pick up their loved ones and give them a proper burial without themselves getting shot. So this is Appendix 4, and this is where I'll wrap up the review. Palestinian figures for homes demolished. The day after Ashraf's home was destroyed, I accompanied the Palestinian officials sent to assess and document the extent of the damage wrought by the Israeli bulldozers. Besides Ashraf's, 3 other houses were confirmed demolished and 2 were reportedly demolished and needed to be checked on. While we were doing our inspection, a man stepped up to tell the officials that his home had been destroyed too. There were 4 rooms, he insisted. You don't believe me? It's not a matter of believing you or not, one of the local government officials and engineer replied. Come to the governorate, bring the documents about your house, the plans. The assessments of the engineer and representatives of Rafah's distribution center and the Ministry of Housing were important in determining who would get compensated for what. The governorate was responsible for compensating non-refugee households. UNRWA was responsible for compensating refugees. There was coordination between the 2 organizations, but their figures for homes demolished were slightly different due to different counting methods. UNRWA counted each building as one house no matter how many housing units it contained. The governorate counted all housing units as individual houses. For example, a demolished multi-story building that contained 3 separate apartments would be counted by UNRWA as one house, but by the governorate as 3. UNRWA, with the lower figures, counted 459 refugee and 94 non-refugee homes completely demolished in Rafah from September 2000, the start of the Second Intifada, until May 2003, when I last visited. A further 72 houses were considered partially destroyed and unsafe. The total of homes that had been damaged but could be repaired was 883. In the same period, UNRWA had built 97 replacement homes. According to UNRWA, in Rafah up to April 2003, 4,781 people from 874 families had their homes completely demolished. When I mentioned to Issa Kara, Public Information Officer for the Gaza Field Office of UNRWA, who gave me the above figures, that an IDF spokesman claimed that only about 45 inhabited houses in Rafah had been destroyed, he said, I have no comment. These are the numbers we have. Nothing more to say, really. Joe Sacco, Footnotes in Gaza, excellent work. One of the key reads, I would say, on Palestine Bookshelf to help you get a visual story of what's happening in a way sometimes that words can't replace. They say a picture's worth 1,000 words, and there's lots of pictures in this book. So it's important to see different types of work on your bookshelf, and this is one I would highly recommend. Get a copy. There's a link in the description. It's an easy way you can support this channel. If you're going to buy it anyway, buy it through our link. If you want to support our channel for free, hit like, subscribe, share this with people who might be interested. If you want to thank me for my presentation, there's links to Buy Me a Coffee and PayPal below. And below that, there's links to Patreon and YouTube membership. That way you can support me on an ongoing basis, get early access to reviews like this one, have a chance to talk with me behind the scenes, and get access to videos that I don't release to the general public. If you'd like to nominate and buy a book for me in the future, my Amazon wish list is below. You'll see links to books about Palestine, books that may be for other things. That's for my main Stephen Hind channel. Feel free to go check that out. But if you buy a copy for me and send it my way, I'll do my best to review it in a timely manner, and it's a way you can sponsor a video. A reminder, as we move towards monetization as a channel, that we want to donate 100% of our profits to the Palestine Children's Relief Fund. They're a medical charity that helps Palestinian children get care that they could not otherwise get. They're a worthy cause. Please check out the link. Go visit them directly. Consider supporting them directly. Or if you'd like to support them indirectly through watching as many videos as you can on this channel and helping us get monetized, please do that. Until next time, enjoy your reading.